Yeah. Right. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Susan, for joining me today. It's wonderful to have this conversation.
It's my
And
pleasure. Thank you.
and so we'll jump right into it. The very first question I have for you is what or how would you define what is considered good or what is considered quality teaching and learning?
The $1,000,000 question. Yeah. I think for me, good teaching and learning, high quality teaching and learning is driven by student needs and interests,
Mm,
and attentive to their need for belonging and community. And it addresses them as a whole person.
yeah.
So, and specifically in to my area of interest, that means not strictly attending to them as cognitive processing machines or strictly mental,
Yeah.
brains on sticks, but that a good teaching and learning experience should be about sensory experiences
Mhm.
and not strictly mental or sedentary.
Right. I like that a lot. And I want to touch on a point you just made about sensory. So this is something that I've been considering actually in my classes for the fall is carrying around with me like not necessarily fidget toys, but things that students could have at their desks. Or I had an idea of having a puzzle in the room. If people were finished early, they could go work on the puzzle. Um, are these things that you're finding are becoming more popular in a higher education context? Is it becoming more accepted for students to bring these things with them?
You know what's so interesting is I think those things are becoming welcome and more common in study spaces
Mm,
and residential spaces. The classroom feels like it's the lagging, right?
right.
Because we feel, I think, so constrained to focus on that like very um a critical use of time inside the 50 or 75 minutes or however long you have, that there's no room for, anything other than focusing on something strictly connected to the course.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Would you recommend it based on your own expertise and knowledge of the value of these
Well,
things?
I think I am persuaded that it's really important to do things in your
Mhm.
classroom, but those activities should be integrated into the learning tasks.
Right.
So instead of thinking about like, oh, yes, just have everybody stand up and stretch as a
Mhm.
break,
Mhm.
um, we should be thinking about how could I ask students to interact with this material or develop knowledge or skills
Right.
by using the room for them to do things.
Mhm. Yes.
Um, and just asking yourself that question sometimes can produce some ideas that are not traditional, but may in
Sure.
fact be more effective for their learning.
Mhm. Well, that actually leads really well into what was supposed to be my next question,
Mhm, mhm.
which is what does authentic learning mean? And then what does authentic learning look like?
Yeah. So I think of authentic learning as having at least two important elements. One is that it should be relevant. So there's some way in which it connects to your lived experience.
Mhm.
Um, and then the second piece is that it's not disposable. And by
Okay.
disposable, I'm falling back on a concept that I learned from the open education movement, which is
Mhm.
to not create disposable assignments. In other words, like things that students produce that have
One time. Yeah.
no value outside of just having them get turned in and graded and thrown away.
Mhm.
And so, if the skill or knowledge that students are acquiring matters to them beyond the boundaries of
Yeah.
classroom or beyond the boundaries of that term, that semester, that quarter, then it's more authentic.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. That is really important. I think sometimes when you're teaching maybe like a general elective or these courses, which aren't necessarily core courses for their degree or what have you, it can be more challenging
Mm.
to come up with ways to make your learning authentic and applicable outside of the
So
classroom.
yeah.
Would you have any tips for
Well,
people to like that?
I was thinking about an example just from my own classroom.
Mhm.
I am teaching an upper level literature course this semester. I'm actually
Yeah.
teaching Shakespeare.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So, Shakespeare might be a good example of a topic that, or a subject that
Hmm.
would seem hard to connect to students' lived experiences
Yeah,
or
sure.
relevant or
Hmm.
produce some sort of non-disposable product.
Yeah.
Um, and what what we've been doing this first few weeks of the semester is reading the history play Richard II,
Right.
which I chose to begin with for a couple of reasons connected to how I could make it authentic. One was that the history plays in general are very
Mhm.
interested in the nature of power struggles and
Right.
leadership. And here in the US, it's an election year.
Mm.
And so without needing to talk about things the way you might in a political science or government class, we can
Yeah.
definitely talk about what are the challenges and struggles of leadership in general?
Mm.
Where does it go bad? How
Mhm.
many ways can it go wrong?
Yeah,
And what are the consequences? And so those issues feel relevant. But
absolutely.
even more so, I was really thrilled just yesterday. The students were presenting some research that they're doing on the play. And so I'm having them go out and follow their own curiosity about things that
Mhm.
they don't know, that they're
Right.
interested in. And one of the challenges is that, in these history plays, we get swamped with all of these names of
Mhm.
families and, um, um,
Mhm.
the title and their land holdings and all of this. And so several of the students were trying to make their way through who is who and how are they connected with each other. And so one of them discovered that the conflict that we see in this first play is the very beginning of the conflict between the Lancasters and the
Mm.
Yorks.
Okay.
And that it turns out the screenwriters for the Game of Thrones
Mhm.
used their two warring families of the Starks and the Lannisters
Okay.
as a sort of takeoff on that family
Wow.
dynastic conflict.
Mhm.
And while on the one hand you could say like, oh, okay, well that's a fun piece of trivia. On the other hand, like I think it was meaningful because it
Yeah.
shows how these themes
Mhm.
continue to be um very compelling for
Yeah.
audiences, and these the good English majors who were the screenwriters of Game of Thrones, like were
Right.
drawing on their knowledge of these stories that are centuries old
Mhm.
because they're still good stories.
Yeah.
And they reveal things about human nature. And so
Mhm.
anyway, that's an example of something that felt like authentic learning to me.
No, that's a great example. And how cool for that student or the group to have made the connection. Yeah. No, I totally agree. That persist, as they say, history repeats itself, but there are some lessons or things that certainly ring true
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
long, long time. So getting into a little closer as well to your area of expertise and what you have very much become known for, which is embodied learning. I wanted to ask you to define for us what is it? What does embodied learning mean? What is it? And then how does it relate to authentic learning?
Yeah. So That's a really good question. And in fact, I spent a lot of my um, time and energy during the Fulbright year
Mhm.
in Ontario when we met, thinking about how I would nail down a definition of embodied learning. And
Mm,
um, as best as I've been able to define it, it's involves physical movement and uses place or space and relationships as affordances for learning. So
that's a
that's a
great
lot. There's
definition.
like at least
Okay.
three
Yeah.
pieces there. But I think they all matter.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's yeah, no, brilliant definition. I'm gonna have to rewatch this recording and listen to you say this again, write it down. Um, and in that then, with your definition, how would you describe to someone or say that embodied learning and authentic learning either are similar, can work in partnership? How do they relate?
Yeah, I would say embodied learning produces authentic learning.
Right.
Because when you've anchored somebody's learning in their lived experience
Mhm.
and literally like their corporeal, their spatial, their
Yeah,
relational experiences, then it's automatically relevant,
sure.
right? And chances are much better that it will also not result in something disposable
Hmm.
because you're having to do things, you're having to
Yeah.
practice. So in the example of, my Shakespeare class this semester, I'm making a real effort to tell them why, for example, I want them to speak the language with their own voices.
Right. Okay.
So, if you teach Shakespeare in a drama program,
Hmm.
then obviously, this is how you're learning it. But in
Yeah.
an English
Yeah.
course, it could be just all about reading
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
maybe watching, but you don't really participate.
Yeah.
And I think you wouldn't really be able to um feel like you've made it your own unless
Sure.
you're using your lips and tongue and teeth and mouth to speak
Hmm.
that language. And so when I am explaining it, why I've assigned students to record themselves reading a
Hmm.
passage in their own voice,
Yeah.
and what I'm able to say is, I'm not trying to turn everyone in the class into an actor. That's really not the
No.
point. The point is that you pick a passage that has already attracted your
Yeah.
interest for some reason and read it
Hmm.
and record yourself reading it. Because the very act of speaking it in your own voice will
Hmm.
then kind of give it a different connection to your lived
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Absolutely. A little bit of not ownership, maybe, but it brings it to life. Certainly
Yes, absolutely.
helps with the connection. Yeah. I
Yeah.
like that. If I
Yeah.
ever have to teach Shakespeare, I can
Well,
remember these tips.
Well, it matters. I think the way that anybody can use that particular technique is if your discipline has any terminology
Mm,
that will be new to students, especially if it's a little bit hard to pronounce.
sure. Yeah.
You, it's really worth taking the time to give them a chance to speak it, use those new words,
Hmm.
and make it part of their speaking vocabulary because then they own it,
Right.
right? A
Yeah.
different way than just I've memorized this term and
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but I think I know what it means. Like when you have to use it and say it. I mean, I think we know this from our own experience as students
Hmm.
now. And there were terms for all of us that started out being a little
Very foreign.
intimidating and it was scary to pronounce them
Yep.
without being quite sure. And I think if we just normalize, like, yep, that's a part of learning. There's hard new words and we need to practice saying them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I fully agree. And that even relates to another question I have for you, which is about the learning environment. When you talk about normalizing things and having that, we'll say, culture of what is normal. So, why does the learning environment matter?
Yeah. Well, so this is so interesting to me. I think the built environment
Mhm.
shapes our behavior,
Absolutely.
and we don't notice it as
Mhm.
much. And in fact, because, the things we were talking about when we first started this conversation, we're just so pressed for time. We get in there and are like, okay, I don't,
Sit down.
whatever arrangement this
Let's go.
furniture is in, let's go. Skipping over a pretty
Mhm.
critical way in which that furniture is going to shape everything that happens in the next 60 to 75 minutes.
Yeah.
So the way that the tables or the desks are arranged already say to your students,
Mhm.
this is what is expected from you in this environment,
Yeah.
which is usually sitting down and being quiet,
Mhm.
not, being interactive. I mean, everybody's always, like, oh, why don't our students want to talk? And it's so hard to get them to discuss. Well, that's
Yeah.
because the room is telling them that's not really what you're expected to do here.
Yeah.
And so even just changing the arrangement of the furniture so that they can make eye contact with each other
Mhm.
sends the message like, "Oh, we're intending to have some sort of interaction here."
Mhm.
And it's true of every every environment or when you have a meeting, um, if you thoughtfully arrange the furniture
Mhm.
in a way so that, for example, it's in a circle or
Sure.
a square, or that there's some sort of sense of community that's
Mhm.
communicated just by the arrangement of the room,
Yeah.
I promise that like that interaction is more likely to be successful
Right.
because you
Mhm.
haven't set people up in a way that and I've seen groups that have already established a good rapport
Mhm.
overcome the
Yep.
obstacles of the built environment. They'll talk to each other no matter how crazy they have to, turn around and but in the words of our mutual colleague Laura Pickell, they're
Mhm.
fighting with the room.
Yeah.
And so we want the room to work for us, not
Yeah.
against.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like your point about being able to make eye contact with one another because you're right. Even when they're in double or you have three desks beside one another, you're not really looking at anyone except forward if that's the orientation of the room, even when you're beside someone. Because when they speak, unless they're speaking to you directly, they're also looking forward. And like you said, you have to like pretzel yourself to turn around and try to
Yep.
participate with others.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I can see how eye contact alone would be a very powerful tool.
Yeah, it is. And I've had some feedback from my colleagues here that like um students some that makes some of them very uncomfortable.
Mm,
And they'll say, yeah, my students don't want to talk to each other.
okay.
Um, but I guess I would push back on that a little bit because the science is just so clear that
Mm,
building a sense of community and
yeah.
belonging is it's not only makes us enjoy the time more, but
Yeah.
it actually frees up some cognitive bandwidth for us to learn because we're
Mhm,
not worried about monitoring our status
mhm,
or how we're interacting in a um, threat kind of way with others. And so I I think faculty need more help learning how to like coach their students
yeah.
into a more interactive norm.
Right.
Back to norms here.
Yep.
Like the classroom norm is that I get to just sort of be in my own little isolated envelope and not interact with anyone else. And if I want to do other things during the time,
Yes.
like
Yes.
it's like, turning on the television or watching
Mhm.
something online. That's sort of the expected norm. And so it's not surprising that we need to do a little bit of work to create a different norm and to explain why it matters and why it's worth, you know, being a little bit open, being open
Mhm.
to having a different kind of classroom experience.
Yeah. I like that. And I like it that it's not just for the instructor, that it's for the students. It's important to explain it to them too.
Super important. I mean,
Yeah.
if they're resistant, there's no other way other than
Mhm.
just to cave and say, okay, well, I guess we're not having any interaction. And I have
Yeah.
colleagues who've told me, like, oh, I tried, but they didn't really
Aw.
do it. And that tells me, like, I have work to do in the teaching and learning center to help my
Mhm.
colleagues know, like, okay, what else might we have tried
Yeah.
besides just giving up?
Yes. Well, with the very limited time we have left with one another, I will ask you one more question because we're talking about classroom norms and built environment. So often we're learning in spaces which aren't authentic to where we're going to be practicing those skills or applying that knowledge. So, what would be your advice on how to create an authentic environment, learning environment, classroom environment, whenever that might be?
Mhm. Well, I think we've already talked about furniture,
Mhm.
so that's one tip. Another tip is to do things like be aware of the natural light in the
Mhm.
room, like open the blinds. I don't
Yeah,
think every room needs to be a cave in order to
right.
see what's on a screen. And, be sensitive to just the sort of human comfort needs in your room. If
Mm.
if your room is really terrible, find reasons to leave.
Yeah.
Like, send them out on discussions where they are in the hallways or the lobby or even
Mhm.
ideally outside.
Outside. Yeah.
If there's, and it doesn't have to take the whole class. If there's, 15 minutes, that would
Mhm.
be a productive way to say, I want you to think about this one question, leave in, groups of 2 or 3 and be ready to come back and share your answers in 15 minutes.
Right.
Um, I mean, we don't have to hold them hostage in
Yeah.
the classroom.
Yeah. No, excellent, excellent advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Well,